spending money on loot boxes or gambling-like mechanics in video games is linked to experiencing gambling harm. Supercell, they know exactly what the rules are. They're just choosing not to follow it. We are now seeing basically a second country will try to implement a ban on loot boxes, but specifically in relation to under 18s.
Leon Xiao is a doctor of loot boxes. He's assistant professor at the City University of Hong Kong, and after doing his PhD in loot boxes, he's released papers charting the loot box regulation landscape and measuring compliance. His work has been featured in mainstream outlets such as the BBC and The Guardian, and GamesIndustry.biz regularly publishes his Loot Box State of Play report. Today, Leon gives us a zoomed-out view of loot box research. I did read through your thesis as well, and it's great. I think everyone who covers loot boxes should read it. For anyone listening or watching, it'll take you an evening, but you'll be exponentially better informed about loot boxes. Highly recommend it. So, am I correct that you've sort of built a team around you now to study this? And can you talk about what the team is doing and what your goals are?
Yeah, sure. So we started off basically looking at the jurisdictions that had some sort of rule about loot boxes. And at the time, it was just me alongside some colleagues who would help me a little bit. But it was just me looking at the video games, looking at the websites, looking at the App Store listing pages. And it does take quite a length of time to properly look at each thing and document it properly, because we always make sure that we take screenshots and we have graphic evidence of anything that we claim. So we previously looked at China, the UK, so jurisdictions that I was in or that I was familiar with. But now, yes, I've joined the School of Creative Media at the City University of Hong Kong, and we're starting this creative media industry policy observatory. And we have now multiple research assistants helping us to look at different jurisdictions. So one person, for example, sitting next door to me at the moment is looking at the situation in Japan, which of course is one of the biggest video game markets and quite unique in that there are a lot of games that are really only marketed or only popular in Japan that our previous research looking at Western countries and China wouldn't have covered. So yes, it's just about expanding this research to jurisdictions that are still very important, but we never had a chance to look at.
Absolutely. And this involves, in order to do the research correctly, this involves actually traveling to all of those countries and, downloading the apps and seeing what's served on those servers. And it's quite an expensive endeavor as well, isn't it?
It depends. For some studies, yes, I did go there. So, for example, for the Belgian study, so Belgium technically has this ban on loot boxes because of the way that their gambling law is drafted. So, for that one, I wanted to make sure that I was there in Belgium and trying to basically find ways as to whether I can break the rules or whether the rules were already broken so I can easily circumvent it. But for the study that I mentioned about Japan, for example, we are just sitting in Hong Kong, but setting the phone settings to the Japanese App Store and looking at the Japanese version of the game, so Japanese language version.
I try to keep abreast of the papers that are being released within the gaming space, and it seems like ever since the WHO listed gaming disorder as an official thing, there was an explosion in papers about that. And so it seems like there's like a lot of activity around that. But, and I guess in my own personal opinion, like the loot box issue is the most important social issue in gaming.
The video game addiction debate, I don't think in any way it is settled in terms of whether people agree whether it should be recognized as a medical condition, standalone medical condition, for example. But yes, that has been very controversial. But I think that's quite similar to loot boxes in that it is super controversial and it has that children are being harmed angle that has been easy to use to get support for funding. I recognize that many of my colleagues who work on other aspects of video game research that are also very important. So, for example, let's say gender representation in video games or whether a video game has enough or good enough accessibility features to help everybody or to enable as many people as possible to play the game. They struggle a lot more with funding. But I think this harming children angle and children are gambling angle has helped us. This is it's quite unique that we've been fortunate.
And it's almost a shame to have to rely on the children angle because we've sort of recognized as a society that gambling can harm adults as well, but it just seems it's like it's the most inarguable angle to go with, right?
Yes, I think that's the one that can get the eyeballs, get the parents worried, and get the policymakers interested. But in fact, I mean, there are some unique concerns associated with young people. So maybe young people wouldn't have engaged with gambling-like products until they are older. But certainly, I think when we're looking at significant amounts of spending, these are not coming from young people. They're not they don't, most of them do not have the facilities or the ability to spend large sums of money. Yes, there might be some spending using parents' credit cards without permission, but it won't be that much. But if we are looking at adults, then there are people spending thousands or even tens of thousands of dollars on loot boxes or gacha mechanics. So, yeah, in terms of harm, I certainly wouldn't say that young people are being harmed more. Adults are just as much at risk, and we should be researching everything. And in fact, a quite unique point that occurred to me recently is that I actually think that specifically we might be wanting to look at the older adults as a group that might be more vulnerable, because I do feel like young people have a degree of what we might call ludo literacy or awareness of games and how it works. If you ask most young people who play video games, they can explain to you how a loot box works, how they're not guaranteed to get things, etc. But if you ask a 70-year-old who is playing a Candy Crush-like game, not necessarily Candy Crush, maybe one of those merge mention games, they also contain loot boxes, but they're not called loot boxes. But there are random rewards that you can spend money to buy. And I'm not sure those older people necessarily realize that they're engaging with such mechanics.
If we were to, I guess, if you were speaking to someone who was brand new to the issue and didn't really know, I thought like they just discovered that loot boxes were a thing. Let's say you're talking to a politician who is newly interested in the topic.
Yeah.
What can we confidently say that we know about loot boxes, given the current state of the research?
So I would say that we know for sure that especially in relation to video games on mobile platforms, more than 80% of them, probably close to 90% of the most popular ones, now sell to players something for real money that is not guaranteed. So the player is being sold randomized products in most mobile games. In terms of the research, what we know is that spending money on loot boxes or gambling-like mechanics in video games is linked to experiencing gambling harm. We cannot say that loot boxes are causing people to develop that. We don't know that. We cannot prove causation. But what we do know is that this group who is more vulnerable to gambling harm is spending more money on loot boxes. And that may mean that a more vulnerable group of consumers is spending more money on loot boxes. What we also know from more recent research that has looked at the same group of people 6 months apart, young people, is that young people who spent money to buy loot boxes were more likely to engage in traditional gambling 6 months later and spend more money on traditional gambling 6 months later. Again, we cannot say that it is because that they engaged with loot boxes that they are now engaging with traditional gambling and spending money on traditional gambling. But what we do see from this is that the same group of perhaps vulnerable consumers are being attracted by this type of gambling-like products. And what's the point to be made from the regulatory aspect is that even though these mechanics appear to be linked to gambling harm, and you are spending money on an unpredictable outcome, these products are not regulated as a form of gambling in nearly all countries.
Absolutely, yeah. And interesting point about that study that you were talking about, the about loot boxes potentially being a gateway into regular gambling. 6 months later, them being more likely to engage in regular gambling, was that it went the other way as well, right? Like if they had engaged in regular gambling, they were also more likely to have bought a loot box 6 months later.
I don't recall exactly, but there have been some research that asked participants to try to remember back which one that they engaged with first, and then which one that they engaged with subsequently. And if I remember correctly, in that research, it was found that it did go both ways. So we're thinking of the possibility, for example, of maybe someone who has experienced harm from traditional gambling, say from slot machines. Uh, and then this person has decided to use a self-exclusion service, meaning that licensed gambling providers in their home jurisdiction would no longer be able to provide them with gambling services because they recognize that they're experiencing harm from it. But then, of course, loot boxes are not covered by such self-exclusion schemes. So this person might then start playing video games and discover loot boxes and then spend more money on loot boxes and experience harm. This is conceivable, but again, more research needs to be done.
Yeah, absolutely. You need to be able to choose not to engage with that. You've released for the last couple of years a sort of state of play for loot boxes, which aims to advise companies, well, I guess all sorts of stakeholders, on what the movements around regulation and stuff like that have been around loot boxes. They've been very handy. I think GamesIndustry.biz was publishing them. I guess we're about 9 months into 2025 at this point. Can you give us a sort of peek into what the State of Play 2025 will cover?
Yes, I think the most important thing to highlight is that Brazil has now basically the legislature in Brazil has passed the law that will ban loot boxes for under 18 and has now handed this law over to the president for approval. My understanding is that the president will approve it. So we are now seeing basically a second country that has implemented or will try to implement a ban on loot boxes, but specifically in relation to under 18s, which honestly is probably more justifiable than a ban on loot boxes for everybody, which is what's going on in Belgium. But this also means that it will be harder to, even harder to enforce because this requires very effective age verification or age assurance to be conducted before a company can determine whether or not this person is over 18 and can then proceed to offer them loot boxes. And also, this has been very controversial in that when it was in the other house actually amended it to allow loot boxes, but restrict certain design features, such as you cannot offer an empty loot box.
Oh.
but this is something that is happening. When it went back to the other house, they put the ban back in. But this is probably going to pass, and this has been the biggest development. In other places, we haven't seen too much movement. I spotted a new proposal in New York, the state of New York in the US, where they're basically proposing to restate some very basic principles, such as if you have a loot box, you are not allowed to have NFTs in it, or you are not allowed to have cryptocurrencies in it. That's
Okay.
just restating existing gambling law. Of course, you're not allowed to
Right.
do this. You're not allowed to have cash in the loot box, and it's also not allowed for whoever sells the loot box to buy back the content of the loot box. But these are like super duh points, and
Yeah.
I'm not really sure it's necessary to have a law saying it. But that is a recent development. But otherwise, no, not much new has really happened. I suppose from the less the new law side and more the assessment of existing law side, the UK decided to rely on the industry to try to self-regulate the concerns around the loot boxes, and the industry published and decided upon these principles that companies are supposed to follow. Um, we looked at whether or not companies have followed these principles, and unfortunately, the vast majority failed to do so. This is our research. Um, so we are now waiting on the UK government to publish its own assessment of the situation. It did promise that if the self-regulation doesn't work, and our evidence is that it didn't work, it will not hesitate to legislate. So we are basically, I think, waiting for that new legislation.
The Brazil story is interesting because, I mean, I guess there were some companies that decided to pull their games from Belgium because of the loot box issue.
Yeah.
But Belgium, just looking it up now, they have a population of about 12 million people. It might be a little easier for a company to just say, we'll not release in Belgium. But Brazil's kind of a different story. There's 212 million people in Brazil. Does that change the algebra at all for a company that's wanting to release a game with loot boxes?
I think especially for the mobile game market, which tends to be what generally the more developing countries, the players in those countries will be preferring the mobile games. So Brazil is certainly a very important market for games like that, and we know that the vast majority of those games rely on loot boxes to monetize. So I think you're absolutely right that companies were happy to abandon the Belgian market or even to release a version of the game in Belgium that will not make them money, or will probably even to a certain extent lose them money in that they had to change it and then basically accept that they will not earn any money from it. But for Brazil, yes, this rule, if it is actually implemented, and I really highly doubt that it could be effectively implemented because of what we have seen in Belgium and also in other countries that have tried to have age verification, age assurance. But yes, Brazil is a much more important market, I would say, than Belgium. So yes, companies would be. I suppose companies would just have to adapt in that they will just not be able to monetize or generate revenue from young people in Brazil.
So you believe it's likely that it will pass, the president will approve it, but compliance, you believe, will be a problem similar to Belgium in that compliance rates are very low. A lot of companies potentially don't even know about it.
Yes, so certainly, I must admit to not being particularly familiar with the Brazilian legislative process, but certainly from the media reporting, what they're saying is that this is a done deal. It's kind of like getting your royal assent in the UK. It's technically the king now has to approve it, but it's a rubber stamping exercise, and I don't think this is such a controversial point that the president so disagrees with that anything different would happen. So I think it is happening, at least from the press releases and the media reports we've seen.
Let's talk about compliance, because many countries have gone with a model of sort of hoping the games industry will regulate itself, especially in the Western countries, it seems. So just to sort of rattle off some of your own research back at you, forgive me, but compliance in the UK for disclosing loot boxes in their ads was around 7%. Apple requires games to disclose loot box probabilities. Compliance was around 64%. In Belgium, where loot boxes are considered gambling, as of mid-2022, 82% of the highest-grossing iPhone games were continuing to sell loot boxes for real-world money. On the Google Play Store, only 29% of games displayed the loot box presence warning label. On the Epic Game Store, only 1 of 14 games studied was properly labeled. So there are a ton of these examples. I could kind of go on with them, but the gist is many Western countries have sort of introduced toothless policy and compliance is extremely low. Why do you think it is that so many Western countries have gone for this self-regulation pursuit?
The idea, I think, is that industry self-regulation has advantages in that it can be more quickly implemented. So, I mean, literally the industry can say, we're going to set up a meeting next week, we're going to agree it the week after, and we're going to start implementing it 3 weeks from now. It is possible. That is not possible in a legislature. Although I do note here how quickly the under 16 social media ban was passed in Australia. They had a consultation of 48 hours. So maybe it is not as impossible as I might think, but generally it is understood that the legislative process should usually take a couple of years, but industry self-regulation can more quickly respond. And this is not just initially, but also in theory to any novel developments that happen later on. So say suddenly there's some really bad form of loot boxes that was invented. Uh, Again, the industry self-regulator can just react immediately and deal with it. But if you want to have a new law that specifically deals with it, that might take you longer. Um, and it's also understood that the industry self-regulator is supposed to have a better understanding of how video games work, how loot boxes work. So if there's some sort of dispute about whether one mechanic should be regulated or not, the industry self-regulator should be in a better position to decide than some government regulator, especially like a generic government regulator who might have to deal with consumer law in other industries or gambling law. But the problem, I think, is also that it's much cheaper to go with this option. You don't have to set up a new regulator, or you don't have to give more funding to an existing regulator to extend their remit to deal with this issue. And I think also this is probably more political, but in Western countries in recent years, there's certainly been this general belief that we should trust the industry to deal with certain problems, and maybe the law should not interfere so much. People have various names for this sort of ideology. But that's why it's happened. In contrast, South Korea, for example, has adopted a law specifically requiring probability disclosures. And this is also, to be fair, after the country tried self-regulation for a number of years, but it didn't work. So perhaps even in the Western countries, the loot box related laws are coming. It's just taking a bit longer. There has been some suggestion in the EU context that the forthcoming Digital Fairness Act will deal with loot boxes. It has not been explained how, but the relevant person in charge has been going around suggesting that this will happen. Loot boxes will be dealt with. But that's not coming for another 5 or even 6 years.
Oh, that long?
At least I would think, because at the moment they're just consulting on people's general vibes. We don't even have a draft law to look at yet, so it will take a long time. And also because of the way EU law is made, there are multiple member states, so it would even be even worse than in one country where there is one party who can pass laws, or multiple parties that can agree to pass laws. It's even harder.
I did email them to get some clarification on that. I guess they'll be busy for the next 6 years, so maybe maybe in 3 years I'll get some clarification.
Yes. But to be fair, I do think that the EU is the consumers in the EU are paying attention to the problem, because my understanding is they have this consultation open for this Digital Fairness Act, and nearly all of the responses, I understand, have actually been because of the Stop Killing Games movement.
Right, yeah.
You have all of these players writing in to talk about that point. So people certainly care about the consumer issues relating to video games.
Yeah, 100%. And there are parallels there as well with the whole question of how much developer labor does it really take to strip out certain features within games, such as calling home to a server, making it a live service game, as well as taking out loot boxes. Like, how much effort does that really take? So definitely some parallels there. I mean, I guess there is I definitely agree. In the wider political sense, the rise of neoliberalism and stuff like that. There's a general society-wide trend in the West towards self-regulation, and I think there might even be some residual trust from years ago in the games industry when the ESRB was kind of often quoted as this example of self-regulation due to their age rating system. And years ago, in the days when there was more of a moral panic around violent video games, trying to create violent children and stuff like that, and the ESRB would self-regulate, and they would say, no, these games are restricted. But I'm not sure the incentives there are the same as the loot box situation, because I don't think the the companies selling ultra violent video games in the States had any desire to target children. Um, Whereas it's kind of it's a different story now. It's we've seen it's almost ubiquitous that
Yeah.
games with loot boxes these days would target children. And when you look at the incentives, then you have some sort of like historical comparisons of like how did self-regulation go in the tobacco industry, how did it go in the fossil fuel industry. In Australia, the gambling industry is very much a factor. So I don't know. I guess I'm like I try to distance myself from arguments that just say like, oh, they're all corrupt, or oh, they're all lazy, or oh, they're all dumb,
Yes.
because
Yeah.
usually real life is more nuanced than that.
Mm.
Maybe it's something more like, oh, politicians just don't want to engage with the gaming issue. Um, but yeah, and at the same time, I'm like, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to see why EA is not going to give up this massive share of its revenue.
No, I mean, from my perspective, like I see the advantages of industry self-regulation. I've said, I mentioned them earlier, but the thing is that what I think is important, whether it's industry self-regulation or if it's a new piece of law, what we need to do is look at whether or not it's actually working. And if it's not working, then we need to do something about it. It's just, I think it's okay to try any reasonable things. And all of these things are within a range of reasonable responses a state might come up with. As long as within that range, I think people are entitled to try it. But what's important is you need to check if it's working. If it's not working, then do something else. And obviously, the industry self regulation in the video game context in relation to loot boxes are not working. Companies are not even doing what they're promising to do, let alone promising more things, more protections. And I think the ESRB example is particularly apt because we can look at what the ESRB has done in relation to loot boxes, or rather what it has not done in relation to loot boxes, right? It was only after considerable pressure that the ESRB decided that, okay, now we're going to put onto the games that we rate this label that says in-game purchases includes random items if the game contains loot boxes. But this is really very euphemistic. What is includes random items? Most parents who do not play games will not be able to understand what that means because conceivably it could just mean that, oh yeah, there are enemies in this game that if you defeat, they drop random items.
Yeah,
And
100%.
also, for other elements in the game, such as violence, it will be graphically represented like a fist, and the age rating systems, or if there's sexualized content, they'll have more graphic depictions of what they're talking about. But this label that's appropriate for loot boxes, supposedly, according to the ESRB and also PEGI, it's just a little bit of text. And it's also often not on the front either, it's on the back. And you really need to be looking for it before you can see it, assuming you can understand it. And we actually have a study done by Australian researchers that has found that this label is not understood by consumers.
Yeah.
So if it's not understood, then it's not going to do very much. And in relation to this age rating thing, we have now seen two countries that have decided that if a game contains loot boxes, then we need to also think about whether we need to increase the age rating for this game to be higher. Those two countries being Germany and Australia. The SRB and PEGI in North America and Europe, they are not taking the presence of loot boxes into account when making the age rating decision. They base that based off of violent and sexualized content. Whether or not the game contains loot boxes is just something on the side. So a game that's rated ESRB-E or PEGI 3 can contain loot boxes. That's a permissible thing. But that's because those two are industry self-regulation, or the criteria at least is designed by the industry. But in Germany, it's more of a co-regulation regime. So yes, there is an age rating organization that's independent from government that makes age rating decisions. But the legislature in Germany can tell the age rating regulator, please take something into account when you make that decision. And that's precisely what they did. They said a couple of years ago, please take the presence of gambling-like mechanics into account when making age rating decisions. So now, games like EAFC So that's the football simulation game from EA. Used to be called the FIFA series. That game is now rated USK 12. So in Germany, so 12 plus. It used to be USK 0, no restriction. Was under the SRB and the PEGI, it's getting E and PEGI 3, so no restriction. Um, Similarly, in Australia, where it's even stricter in a sense than co-regulation, it's an entirely legal regulation regime for age ratings. They just said if the game contains loot boxes, this needs to be which means not recommended for anyone aged under 15. So it's
Yeah.
possible to do more, but the self-regulators have decided not to do.
Yeah, absolutely. It was funny. I was reading one of your studies, and you were talking about how the physical copies of games being manufactured in Germany, sent over to the UK,
Yes.
had different age labels on them, which was confusing for some of the consumers. And I wanted to let you know, I wish I could show you, but I think the last physical copy that I bought here in Australia had 3, maybe even more labels on it, because it was manufactured in Germany, sent through the European PAL territories, then shipped to Australia with the Australian classification label slapped on it. So it had like a minimum of 3 classification systems on the physical copy. And I think that, I can't remember what game it was, but I think it was one that did have loot boxes, and they were wildly
Mm,
different. They were like,
right. Yeah, yeah.
yes, some were like, this is for adults. Some were like, kids that are 3 can play this.
All right. And I think the problem with this is that it takes away trust from parents in the system, right? Parents were like, oh, yes, this regime was previously advising me. When I was growing up, my parents were using these age ratings. And certainly there was quite a bit of reliance on it. But now if parents are seeing, oh, this is apparently 3, but also 15 plus, which is it? Can I still trust this system? How are they making these decisions? Why is it so varied? This is also happening now on the Apple App Store, for example, where we're seeing some games are getting an Apple age rating. So say 4, because it's at least the depiction of things is very cartoonish. But then it's being slapped with a 15 plus rating in Australia or an 18 plus rating in Australia because the law so requires. So now it's saying 4 plus, but also 18 plus.
Yeah.
Then the parents again say,
Part of that is, I mean, we kind of mentioned it before, when we talked about how some of the labels have like a visually recognizable element, like, the fist for violence.
yes.
Randomness will be represented as like dice or something like that. But
Mm-hmm.
randomness, I mean, probability in general, but also this whole loot box issue is just not intuitive for most people. It's an issue where it's like, if you would ask a parent about, like violence in media or something like that, like, oh, if something's extremely violent, like of course they don't want their 6-year-old watching it. Like it's all very intuitive and easy.
Mm.
But explaining the difference between something that is mechanically gambling versus something that's aesthetically gambling is
Mm.
a little less intuitive. And a great example of this, I thought, came up when December last year, Balatro was given a
Yes.
different rating. It had been out for about 10 months. Was very successful, won some awards, and then PEGI decided to change its 8 plus rating to 18 plus due to prominent gambling imagery. And later this was reassessed and the rating was brought down to 12 plus.
Yeah.
And the developer took to Twitter and basically said, like, hey, we've got games with actual gambling and loot boxes, like, EAFC, which are targeted at young people. Meanwhile, my game is slapped with a higher rating. It's not gambling. It just looks like poker. So what's the lesson here? And I think that's like a perfect illustration of, I guess, our societal values, because it looks like a gambling game, but it's not. So it forces us to look at our priorities. Like, do we care about gambling or do we care about the appearance of gambling?
Yeah.
And can we teach people the difference?
Yes, and I think the Australian case is actually particularly interesting here, in that when the Australian classification regime was updated last year, or rather it took effect, the update took effect last year, it had that bit about loot boxes being 15 plus. but specifically it said in-game purchases with an element of chance, 15 plus. That would be the mechanically like gambling that you described. But what's more interesting, I think, is the 18 plus rule, which applies to simulated gambling. So this was, I think, intended to deal with these so-called social casino games. So these are games that allow you to spend money to buy virtual currency and to participate in traditional gambling activities, including playing slot machines, playing blackjack, playing poker. But the thing is that even if you do win virtual currency, you cannot convert it back into cash. And it's for that reason that it's not regulated as a form of gambling. It's literally worse than gambling in some ways because you can
That's
never
right.
win. You
Because you
literally
can't get the
cannot
money
win.
back. Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
But for that reason, it's not regulated as gambling. So it's permitted even in countries that will not allow traditional gambling, for example. Uh, that's what it was intended to deal with because in Australia, there have been cases where people experience gambling harm because it turns out that when engaging with these products, people are not necessarily there wanting to win money. People would spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on these games, knowing that they cannot actually win any money. There have been real Australian cases. I think that's what the 18 plus rule was intended to deal with. But what the rule actually deals with is not just that, but also any traditional gambling motifs. So, if, for example, in your open world role playing game about being a cowboy, most of the game is spent riding around on a horse, shooting outlaws, etc. Okay, maybe for those elements, the game would also get a high rating. But okay, maybe let's take away the shooting of other people. Let's say you're just a cowboy riding around in open world. That's it. However, if in this game there is a slot machine that you can interact with and you can play with your virtual currency that you earned by, let's say, delivering something from one town to another. This is now simulated gambling, and this game must be 18 plus just because of that. Even though you cannot actually spend any real money to put it into this game to get virtual currency to play on that slot machine. So this slot machine, which is not capable of causing any financial harm, has to be 18 plus. And this is what happened with Balatro. If Balatro comes, if it's published today, and it has to be assessed under the new classification in Australia, it's 18 plus. Same with some of the really old games. Well, I say really old games, but not really. From when I was a child, you had the Luigi's Casino in some of the Super Mario Brother
Oh, yeah.
games.
Yeah.
You had in Pokemon the Game Corner. Those were slot machines, blackjack, etc. Now they're all no longer available in the updated versions of the relevant games that they've remade. But I don't think those things caused harm. And certainly there is no research to suggest that mere depiction of traditional gambling motifs cause harm. But the rule has been so adopted. I always thought the distinction should have been drawn. The 18 plus rule was meant to deal with the social casino game, so where you can actually spend money on the traditional gambling motifs. Okay, but not just traditional gambling motifs with no possibility of spending money. Peggy used to have a very strict position that's the same as the position now in Australia. So if there's any depiction, boom, it's Peggy 18, including in like this game called Overboard, which was just this detective mystery game. Where there was just a very small part of the game where there was like a card game. And actually, the whole point of that depiction was to show that gambling is not good for you and gambling can be harmful, etc. But even that is not acceptable, and that game was slapped with Peggy 18. But now Peggy has decided that they will exercise more discretion. They will actually look at the context of the whole game to decide. But Australia now has this position as law. So
Yeah, I'm actually really glad you brought that up because it's a great illustration of societal priorities. It's hard to get policy to see gambling unless it looks like gambling. And I talk a lot about the potential for like a mechanical definition of gambling. And I know there's like different legal systems have different legal definitions, and
Yeah,
then there's like a psychological definition of gambling.
yeah,
And my own personal definition is a lot simpler. It's more to do with like, wagering
mm,
value
mm,
for a random result that results in
sure,
value. And I
yeah,
always use the word value because to me, there, other things are valuable as well, other than
yeah,
currency, right? Like my
yeah,
time, my effort, that's all
yeah,
valuable. So yeah, I don't know. It's like, but it's hard to get people who don't engage with this day to day. It's hard
mm,
to get them to see this unless it really has those motifs, like it looks like a slot machine, that type of thing.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I think you're absolutely right. I mean, we have policymakers who do not engage with video games, right? It's kind of nice sometimes when I meet the younger ones who actually play games and they have a lot of understanding. But most policymakers have not played games where they only play many, many years ago. So they can't really conceive, I think, of why a loot box necessarily is going to be a problem unless you explain it to them. But certainly, if it does not involve money or something of value, well, like yeah, the time, like you said, it really shouldn't be counted. I don't think like the slot machine that you cannot spend money on in your game. That why is that being counted? You know?
Yeah, I'll play devil's advocate for just a second because I don't I kind of don't have a huge problem with the simulated gambling getting an 18 plus, but I'm famously a hardliner on all these things. So like I'm
Yeah,
more of the I sort of categorize anything that falls under that definition of gambling as something that should be 18 plus. And I guess there's a couple of points there. Like the first one being, do you think there's any chance that because we can talk about harm in terms of like direct
mm,
financial harm and the potential for like an indirect harm. So do
yeah,
you think, I mean, direct financial harm, probably not the case. I mean, you can't spend
no,
money on it. So that's kind of moot. But could there potentially be like an indirect harm in the sense that like, if we're talking about cigarettes, like, little kid
yeah, yeah,
sees cool people in a movie smoking cigarettes, thinks that smoking is cool, goes and buys those toy cigarettes, um, you know,
yeah,
as a potential gateway. I guess that
yeah.
sort of argument, but ported over into the loot box and gambling
Oh
universe.
yes, yeah. The cigarette shaped chocolates.
Yeah, yeah.
That was the thing. Um, I think this is very unlikely to be supported by any scientific evidence. These things are too disjointed from each other. What I thought you might say is, are we looking at a situation where this player might decide to spend a lot of time to grind inside this game to get virtual currency so that they can go and play on the slot machine? I thought they were going to say that, and my response to that would have been, I don't think in any of these games you would have a substantial number of players doing that. It might be a few, but uh, and really, I'm not sure a very wide and restricted measure is necessary to deal with situations like that. But with the situation that you suggest, I think this is unlikely to be something that would exist in the real world. And if there is an effect, the effect size will be so small that I don't think it matters.
I was talking about sort of unethical game design
Yeah,
long before loot boxes were a thing. So, back in 2012 or thereabouts, that was the time of the MMO gold rush and everyone
mm,
was trying to pivot to MMO. World of Warcraft was very successful. So, of course, everyone was talking about World of Warcraft and they were coming up with their own systems. And so around that time, I was talking about the sort of Skinnerian and Pavlovian techniques that were used to keep people playing for longer and paying for longer, which in those days it was just a monthly subscription. And, loot boxes obviously have much more potential for financial harm. But I guess coming from like, with that being my perspective, coming from that place where it's like, talking about games in that context where I sort of would acknowledge that this is unethical And even within that space, if you acknowledge it's unethical, it's like, okay, well, then maybe there should be some kind of warning label or some kind of age restriction. And I guess coming from that, it's easier for me to look at like a simulated gambling system and think something, very similar. Like, there are kind of dark
Yeah,
patterns at work here.
yeah,
And one of
yeah,
the things that I'm sort of reminded of is
yeah.
when you talk about a Skinner box, like obviously, B.F. Skinner, who designed the Skinner box and released those papers about how to get rats to pull the lever more using, random reward schedules and things like that. He had this quote that constantly comes up in my mind about the aesthetics being as important as the mechanics when it comes to operant conditioning, which is what he called the sort of, conditioning of the subject in the Skinner box. And so, he was talking about operant conditioning, not gambling, but these days, operant conditioning and gambling are so intertwined. Loot box systems, like you can buy several and get yourself into a flow state, just cycling through loot boxes. And so, yeah, for me, the whole aesthetic side of it is something that I feel like should be explored, if that makes sense. Because, I'm obviously the mechanical side is probably the most important. But I am reminded of that quote of like when we're being conditioned in that way, the aesthetics, at least he believed, was as important.
I guess to me, a couple of points come to mind. The first being that the dark patterns that you might see in the MMO games that keep people, playing more, like, say this enemy drops a very nice loot, but very, very rarely, so you have to keep fighting it again and again. Maybe you don't really want to fight it anymore. You're not getting any enjoyment out of fighting it, but you just want the rare thing. Things like that. I feel like that affects a lot more people than this hypothetical situation where if someone is affected by this simulated gambling that does not involve money. I don't think that one mechanic is really going to affect that many people. So I would say that those dark pattern issues, they're more concerning because they affect more people. So probably it's deserving of more attention. Another point is also that I think we need to think about the wider context in which young people nowadays live. The amount of gambling advertising that is floating around everywhere, that is probably going to be far more likely to encourage them to participate in traditional gambling when they
Mm.
can or soon than this simulated gambling machine in a video game. I appreciate that there is concern, but I think there are much more concerning things than that that we probably should be paying attention to, and certainly like a legally restricted to 18 plus would not be an appropriate response for simulated gambling that does not involve real money, in my opinion. There are other things that you could be dealing with to try to reduce gambling harm or future gambling harm to young people. And also, this is a very novel point, perhaps, and entirely untested. But I have been thinking about it because I did say that when I was younger in the games there were Luigi's casinos and game corners. Um, I do wonder whether, to a certain extent, these games could act in a way that sort of um, helps to protect the young person. In that they tried engaging with it, they realize it's not particularly interesting,
Mm.
and then maybe they don't want to do it. But again, this is going to likely vary person by person, but that could be a potential effect. Now I played Jack when I was, I don't know, 10 in Mario, and well, not particularly interesting. Haven't had the desire to do so again since then.
Yeah, I think great points there. Definitely take your point about the gambling advertising. We're absolutely drowning in that in Australia, and esports is it's everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, and the idea that you could even maybe build up a resistance as a young person through simulated gambling is an interesting one.
Especially, I think, when it could be part of the narrative, and it is part of the narrative in some games when it involves some sort of gambling. That the message that the game is trying to stand is, don't do this. Look, your player character lost, and it was terrible for them. but even a message like that would not be permissible if you make an interactable a simulated gambling mechanic to deliver that message. Another point onto this, and people have been talking about this in the context of uh, the social media ban, for example, that it's probably better for the young person, and I certainly think this makes sense to me, to slowly expose them to potentially risky content increasingly, so that they're not dropped into the deep ocean when they turn 16, or when they turn 18 and they can suddenly gamble, and then boom, now you have everything, but you have had absolutely no experience, no education.
The local body here, one thing that they're fond of saying, the local games industry body, I should say,
Yeah.
the science isn't in yet. And, I've literally heard this spoken to a politician who was on a live stream with lots of people asking about loot box regulation.
Yeah.
I try to pay attention to the science, and for me, it's kind of pretty much all gone in one direction. And I can't imagine what that feels like for you as the person who releases the science, as the person who does the science, watching this sort of line get trotted out. Like the science isn't in yet, and you must be thinking, I made the science.
I also agree to a certain extent that the science is not in, but the thing is, the science probably will never be in, because to get the best quality of evidence, the research method would, for example, require you to have two random sample of young people, expose one of them to these mechanics, and ensure that the other never engages with it, and then 10 years later look at the situation. A research design like that is just not realistic. And
And
also,
that's to build a causal link. Is that right?
yes, yeah. This will be a randomized control trial. But also, even for some of the research that we have done with the surveys, we do not have access to the best quality data because the industry doesn't share the data with us, right? What we have to rely on is asking people to remember how much they spent on loot boxes. But how accurately could people really remember how much they spent on loot boxes in the past month or even past year across multiple games? Um, did you forget that one little bit of spending? I'm sure no one went and actually tallied all of their receipts. So we don't even have the best data when we produce the evidence that we did. But what we have been saying is to the industry is, well, then help us create better science, help us do better research to answer what is a scientific question that is of public interest. If there's no problem, you can prove it. Well, you can help us prove it. There's no
Yeah.
problem. But just generally with this, the science is not in thing is, yes, that's true. And that probably means that we shouldn't adopt the most restrictive regulatory approach. So we probably shouldn't ban loot boxes for everybody, especially when gambling is perfectly allowed. Like that would be too extreme in light of what we have. But that doesn't mean that we can't do certain things, such as requiring more transparency, about the probabilities of getting different items, or that the game contains these items. But even for these companies, some companies certainly have promised to do, and they're not doing it. I think it's quite different from when we're thinking about, say, the tobacco industry or the gambling industry. Even yes, there are multiple companies, but their interests are quite aligned.
Yeah.
The gambling companies would like to offer more gambling, right? The tobacco companies would like to offer, there's some more products, but it's different for the video game industry in relation to loot boxes. You have different stakeholders within the industry. Some parties would love for loot boxes to be unregulated so they can sell more loot boxes, certainly. But there are also a lot of companies who would rather see these things gone because they are bringing some very bad reputation to the whole industry, and in some ways taking revenue away, right? If someone is spending money on loot boxes, hundreds of dollars, let's say, then that person is not buying a number of premium games, that's what we call them today, premium games that they have to pay to buy. And that is taking revenue away from companies that produce those games.
Just to clarify, with those companies that that would rather see the loot boxes go away, are you mainly talking about like smaller publishers like Devolver, but probably not the large, like the big three or the big?
Epic Games have actually taken a very strict stats, right? They removed loot boxes from all of the games in their portfolio back in 2019. The CEO of Epic has been criticizing these mechanics since then. Uh, in some ways, I think that may also be somewhat of a PR stunt to be the only major player who is taking a very strict stance about this. It also helps you to a certain degree. Where we're still thinking about other issues that you have in Fortnite, for example. But it's not necessarily like the smaller indies who are thinking this. There are plenty of other companies who are thinking the same thing. I think Nintendo, for example, has become more hesitant about this. It experimented somewhat with these mechanics with the Fire Emblem mobile games. Um, Similarly, there was a Mario Kart mobile game with these mechanics. There was an Animal Crossing mobile game with these mechanics. Uh, the Animal Crossing game has been switched now to a premium game. They're actually selling it for I think about $10, something like that, and then you can play it. No loot boxes anymore. The Mario Kart game, if I remember correctly, is basically being sunsetted, but not quite. So I don't think you can buy more loot boxes anymore. But Nintendo, I think, is seeing that maybe this is not so good, and it brings a bad taste, I think, to parents, right? Because if you want to also sell them the other products, you don't want to have this under your name as well.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes sense, especially for Nintendo's family-friendly image.
Mm.
I'm glad you brought up the potential for using industry data and what that could do for the research. I made a note of a fun part of one of your studies where you noted that when it comes to the industry, or the research that the industry conducts that has to do with violent video games, they're more than happy to share it.
Yes.
When it comes to the research that they do that make the games industry look good,
Mm.
they're
Yes.
they're happy to share it. But when it comes to loot boxes, there's no sharing going on. I think that's telling in itself. But I am curious to know, like, if you, like, say for example, Ubisoft comes to you tomorrow and says, here's all our player behavior data and transaction data. Use it however you wish. What would be the first few things that you would target? Like, this is like wave a magic wand kind of stuff.
What's immediately coming to mind is we can do some incremental research. So some of the surveys that we've run, we can run them again, but this time with higher quality data. There have been studies that has been done in Oxford working with the leading companies like Nintendo, where, for example, Nintendo sent out this survey to Animal Crossing players. They had survey responses from those players, but also the actual player data from Nintendo about those players, and then they did research on that. We can do similar things in relation to loot boxes, which would help us to verify some of the relationships that we have found. But I think what's a lot more interesting to me is actually trying to implement and test certain interventions inside the games. Um, Sort of like A/B testing, in that, okay, so in this loot box design, we put the probability disclosures here with this tiny little button, and if you tap on it, you can see it. Versus in a different mode, we just show the probabilities on the page where you buy loot boxes. You don't have to do anything; it will just be shown. And maybe there's a third design where if you get onto the loot box purchase page, there'll just be a pop-up window and it stays there for 5 seconds, telling you what your probabilities are. Does that affect how people spend money? Does that affect specifically high spending players' behavior? Uh, Loads of things that we can do, not just with the data that companies already have, but also to be part of the whole design. Because now, I would like to believe that some companies are actually looking into, okay, yeah, we sell loot boxes because it's legally permitted that we sell loot boxes. So we think it's okay to generate revenue from it. But we also recognize that we don't want to generate revenue um, in such a way that would harm people. So we would like to identify the high spending players and maybe find ways to cap their spending or in some ways encourage them to spend less. Uh, there are ways to do that inside the game. they do all sorts of behavioral tracking for other things to try to sell you things. But similarly, they can do it to try to not sell you things or try to make you spend less, maybe.
In the recent studies that I read, you mentioned there was one game from Japan that did cooperate with researchers, but
Mm,
I believe it was past its sort of live service uh, date. Like it was no longer being
yes,
offered.
that's
And so I
right.
guess the nature of what you're talking about, you would kind of necessarily need the game to still be a live service. Is that right?
For that game, that game was retired. It's a defunct game. So the company just had the data associated with the game that they don't really care about anymore, and they just gave it
Right.
to the university. And they also happened to give it to Harvard Business School, which again is pretty good PR potentially, right? Like, oh, Harvard
Yeah.
Business
Yeah.
School use our data to do that. Pretty cool. Certainly, we see companies would prefer to collaborate with universities with that are better known, right? And then this, in some ways, incentivizes or promotes certain researchers over others.
To get a press release, I guess.
Yeah, you get a University of Oxford press release, for example. This is not necessarily a bad thing in that some of these universities, they are better known because they're better funded, and so they have more researchers who are researchers with better equipment. So conceivably there are good reasons for this, but we do also recognize there are some very good researchers working in lesser known places who might never get the opportunity to do this sort of collaborative research, especially if we're looking into, say, developing countries, right? Because this video game issue, it's a global issue, man. Where we're thinking in the context of the UK, Australia, China, but we shouldn't forget about the Brazilian players that we were talking about earlier, or the players in Southeast Asia. I think it would be quite inconceivable for a company to decide to collaborate with, say, a university in Indonesia to do this sort of research in relation to Indonesian players, where they're probably the best equipped to do that research on. But
Hmm.
it, now this is perhaps just a general reflection on certain
Yeah.
global realities, shall we say.
Do you have any hope that something like that might happen in the future, where a major publisher opens up in a way that you're talking about, where it's like it's a live service game. There's some degree of control that the researchers have over the experience. They're free to A/B test, and then pie in the sky, maybe even open source the data. Do you have is that on the
Yeah,
cards in our lifetime?
I think it's conceivable. Uh, there is of some relevance. There has been this study where Meta agreed to share Instagram data, but in a very open science way. People sending proposals. These were all transparently reviewed uh, because we are of course concerned that companies will share data with researchers that they're buddy buddy with, and then there's conflict. The researchers would also uh, produce results that might be more favorable to industry interests because not necessarily because they've been paid to do it, but because perhaps in the future they would also like to get data again. But if they produce results that are bad against them, they may not get the data again. But there is that Instagram project that's ongoing that I think if that is successful, that does certainly provide a blueprint for what could be done in the video game context. But
Interesting.
one thing I would say about the A/B testing is that, unfortunately, this is a practical concern and perhaps a bit too technical. But um, if we're testing, like when I said earlier, whether we provide more transparency to some consumers and less transparency to other consumers, this might actually be illegal in some jurisdictions where
Oh,
you're
really?
not that you shouldn't be doing this. That everybody should be given the maximum uh, transparency. So we might not be able to do like this sort of A/B testing simultaneously. So maybe we'll have to be like, okay, so before we adopted this really nice intervention, the results were like this. But after we adopted this intervention, the results like that. But anyway, even with these things, we can work around it. I've had companies say, "Oh, if we share data, we're going to be in breach of data protection laws." Uh, yeah, potentially, but there are ways around it. You can ask players to consent to sharing their data for scientific research. And I'm sure many players will be very happy to do this because they recognize this would be in the public interest and their interest too.
Before we end, I'll send you an email with this image. You might have seen this before. It's Valve's description of their drop rates for loot boxes as it was disclosed to China. It reads, if you manage to get an ultra rare tier item, yellow, its relative ratio to covert item red is 2 to 5. Covert item red to each adjacent lowered tier pink, and so on, its relative ratio is 1 to 5. Same quality but variant item has same chances of outcome. Any items that has stat track variant, its relative chance for stat track is 1 out of 10, not 1 to 10.
If you manage to get an ultra rare tier item yellow, its relative ratio to convert is to, oh my God. Yes, we've seen things like this. We've seen mathematical formulae disclosed where you have to plug in various numbers, and then you have to do like square root of this. And
oh my God, really?
I mean, because I guess the rule technically said, please disclose. It did not say that you need to disclose very well. They should say that. It should say that you should disclose using a percentage-based value.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but different sort of, regions have different requirements on exactly what constitutes disclosure of loot box odds. So like, China might be a little different to South Korea. So is this what Valve did with their loot boxes here? Is that compliant in some regions, but not others?
So to be honest, what I'm reading now, I don't think it is sufficient. So we have, for example, one good example to answer that question would be in South Korea, where they require that the probability attached to every single possible result is provided. So for example, if your loot box has 10 different items, we need 10 percentage-based values. So you cannot say, for example, 10% chance of getting a legendary item and 90% chance of getting a rare item. A lot of companies do that. That's not allowed. So that might be an example where there's a specific rule requiring more detailed disclosure. And what's interesting here is that EA actually decided to withdraw its loot boxes from the South Korean market because they would not like to comply with that particular rule, which is particularly telling. EA is treating South Korea as if it banned loot boxes because the only other jurisdiction where it does not allow loot boxes is Belgium. And now South Korea has been added to this disclosure message that says, in these two countries, we don't sell loot boxes, basically.
So they really, really don't want to disclose their odds.
Yeah. And I guess the thing is, in some of their loot boxes, they have thousands of items. So the probabilities would be like 0.000. It would be something ridiculous. And I guess they don't particularly want to share that. What they used to do in the past is just to say less than 1%, which is not very good because it could mean 0.99%, or it could mean 0.000000001% or something like that. But then, on the other hand, we also have Apex Legends, also a game by EA that, because of the South Korean rule, disclosed now in more careful detail about how the loot boxes work. And they actually did this not just for South Korea, but globally. So in some ways, we also see these rules, even though it only applies to one country, helping consumers in other countries, because I guess the company can't be bothered to make different loot boxes for different countries. So once they share the information for one place, they might as well just share for everybody else too.
Given that self-regulation in a lot of contexts has not succeeded, should we follow your example of reaching out wherever we can to classification boards and companies, and failing that, naming and shaming on social media? Does self-regulation actually mean us regulation? Like, do we have to be the Karens of the games industry, so, noticing that a game was updated and, complaint.
I guess the thing is, that does work from our experience. In some contexts, it worked. Like in the Australian context, we've had games that had the wrong rating. Pokemon TCG Pocket, for example, had a wrong rating. We asked for it to be changed. It was changed. So doing that can certainly bring change. But the problem is that is kind of reliant on volunteer work, right? And I did it because it's interesting from an academic research perspective to check it and to try it. And usually what I do is I would do a test case or two, but I realistically cannot go after every single instance that I find. And most of the time when I write to companies, they do not reply. It depends. Sometimes they reply really quickly and change it, but other times they just ignore me. Um, I think players can certainly play a role here in that if they accumulate, if enough players can play, I think we can see change. Um, but I don't know. This is not the way it's supposed to be, right? Governments are supposed to be responsible for ensuring concerns are addressed and rules are followed. But perhaps in the reality that we live in, um, that's what we need to do if we want to see those changes made. Um, I certainly would encourage anyone who has the time and the interest to do it because you might be the first person to see it. Or you might be the first person to see it who understands that there is something wrong about it. Then, if you see it, you got the time, why not do it? It's only going to help. But don't feel any pressure to do it. It's not your job. It's not anybody. Well, it's the government's job, but or the self-regulator's job. But yeah, just no pressure is what I would say. It helps.
And it'll probably be a full-time job if you're going after Supercell, right? Because they'll ignore you for a while and then they'll implement the warning in the ads, but it'll be in really small text.
Yes, and for some reason they seem to think that is somehow compliant, even though we have previous cases specifically saying that if you do it that way, it's not good enough. It should. I mean, it is obvious, but we try.
Yeah, yeah. Well, bless you for trying. I think you're doing great work.
What I'm hoping to do actually, probably a few years down the line, but maybe we'll get started sooner than that, is to actually create a website where they can click on a map, click on a country, and then see the relevant rules. Maybe that'll help people. Because I do think actually, especially with a smaller like Supercell, they know exactly what the rules are. They're just choosing not to follow it. But there are smaller companies based in some countries that perhaps really genuinely do not know the rules and they do not have the resources, or if they do, they have not dedicated enough resources to find out what the rules are. And in those cases, maybe if we provide them with the resources, they will comply better. And if that's what it takes, it's not particularly costly to do something like that.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, the next time something major happens that we need help sort of making sense of, or if and when you launch that website, would love to have you back.
Yeah, sounds
please
good.
do.
Yes.
And I appreciate you stopping by on the podcast. Thank you so much, Leon.
No, it's been good fun.